As I said, my name is Jordan Raine. I'm a developer at Clio. And I've been a Rails developer for about 10 years as well. It's 10 years this fall. And during that time, I've had the chance to upgrade Rails apps from Rails 2 to 3 and Rails 3 to 4 and Rails 4 to 5. And I still remember back in the Rails 2.3 days, when you were going from Rails 2.3 to Rails 3, it was really, really painful. It was really difficult. There was so many breaking changes. And there was a lot of good reasons for that, but it still didn't make it any easier to upgrade those apps. And then Rails 3 came along and things got a lot better. And ever since then, things have been getting easier and easier to upgrade. We now have deprecation warnings that every new major version, you get lots of really helpful hints on where you want to change your app. And you also get these beta periods, which you can use the new version of the app or the new version of Rails, and you can tweak it and use it in CI or beta or development and give feedback. And Rails is now 12, 13 years old, something around there. And it's really become a mature framework. And you can tell by the upgrade path. But even with all of those improvements, it's still really difficult to upgrade Rails. And I found myself asking this question earlier this year when we were faced with the next Rails upgrade for our company. Why is it still so tough? And I want to dig into exactly what made it difficult for us and what maybe makes it difficult for other people as well in 4 parts today. Starting with a story of 2 Rails upgrades. The first Rails upgrade is about a small startup. And this startup has a few developers, and it has an app for some people, but it's not mission critical. And when one of their developers is scrolling through Twitter, they see this tweet. Rails 5.2 is out. She doesn't have much to do that afternoon, so she decides to upgrade the app. She runs bundle update Rails and upgrades a few other gems to get things rolling, runs a test suite, there's a couple failures, tweaks everything as she goes, and by the end of the day, she has a pull request to upgrade the app. She sends it off for code review, and the next day somebody goes through it, and then they work through all the major app paths, make sure that it works, test it, and they push it by the end of the day. So about 24 hours after the Rails, new version of Rails is out, it's also running on their servers. And then there is a different company, a larger company, a company with 30 or 40 or 50 developers. They've got many, many years of code. And when they see the tweet from DHH, instead of feeling excited about using active storage, they feel dread because they're now running 1 major version behind and 2 minor versions behind. And now their app is running out of maintenance. So they can't defer it anymore. So they start up a team, maybe 3, 4 developers, and they're devoted to just upgrading Rails. They make changes, and as they do, they ship small bits. And bit by bit, they upgrade the app. And 3 months later, they're ready to go. Now, they haven't done this for many years. And in fact, the last person who did it left the company. So they don't really have a lot of experience in this area. So what they do is schedule some downtime on a Sunday night. They don't want to take any risks. They want to be very careful. And because their app is used by thousands of people and it's mission critical, they can't take any chances. They push it out, and it sticks. It was a successful upgrade. It went relatively well, all things considered. It may not seem fair to compare these 2 upgrades. The first company only had a few gems to upgrade. They only had a few lines of code to change because they didn't actually have that much code in their code base. And they only had a few test failures because, again, not many tests. And when it came time to deploy, it wasn't a mission-critical app, so they could take more chances. On the other hand, the big company had many, many gems, some of which weren't maintained anymore. And they had hundreds of thousands of lines of code to comb through. And this code was also old, so it used weird Rails 2 patterns or calls to undocumented methods, which happened to no longer exist. So it was painful. And when it came to tests, they couldn't even see how many they had failing because their test suite wouldn't even run. When it came time to deploy, it was terrifying because they hadn't done it. They didn't know exactly what could go wrong, and they couldn't risk taking the app down. But fundamentally, what both of these companies did was the same. They upgraded their gems, they changed their code, they tested it, and they deployed. There's no question that one company had a lot more to do at each step, but the end result was they're running the latest version of Rails. And that brings us to Clio. Clio is a SaaS product for lawyers, and we help them run their business and be productive using the cloud. And our upgrade path looks a lot like that second company. And earlier this year, when we wanted to upgrade to Rails 5 and Rails 5.1 and Rails 5.2, I wanted to look back at our past and see why it had been so difficult and why we waited so long to do it. And so to bring you up to speed on what we've been doing, I want to show you a timeline of our Rails upgrades. This starts in 2007, before the app was launched. This is when it was still being developed by our founders. And the first upgrade we did was to Rails 2.0. It came out in December of 2007. The very same day, we upgraded the app to Rails 2.0. A couple months later, Rails 2.1 comes out, and again, the very same day, we're up on Rails 2.1. 2.2 comes out. We lag a few months now. The app's in production. We've got other things on our mind. And then we're up on 2.2. 2.3 comes out, and now we're lagging about 6 months. And we're up on 2.3. And then 3.0 comes out. And then 3.1 comes out. And then 3.2 comes out. And then, running on the edge of maintenance here, we upgrade to 3.0, 3.1, 3.2 over a 5-month period. And then 4.0 comes out. And 4.1. And 4.2. And again, 2015, we get that feeling of pressure, and we upgrade 4.0, 4.1, 4.2 over 6 months this time. Then 5.0 comes out, and 5.1, and 5.2. And when I saw this, I wondered, what were we doing? There's an obvious pattern here, and it's not a good one. And I was surprised to find that the parts that I found, the parts that were most interesting to me was not 2012 and 2015 when we were upgrading the app. It was the in-between time, the gaps, the times where we apparently were doing nothing. But when I looked a little bit closer and thought about it, I realized we weren't doing nothing. We were doing a lot of good things for our business. We were hiring developers, we were building features, we were adding customers, and we started to make money. These are important things. These are good business decisions. But at the same time, we were making some questionable ones. So let's look at some of the problems that we found and that we experienced. So for those of you who have not been on a Rails upgrade team, I want to show you a photo of what it can sometimes feel like. So an amazing thing happens when you go to upgrade your framework. You find a lot of stuff in the closet. You open your gem file and you find outdated gems. You open pieces of code that you haven't used for many years and you find some pretty crazy stuff. Sometimes it even gets blamed back to you. And when we opened our gem file, what we found was a lot of out-of-date gems. And it's very tempting to add a gem when you have to ship a feature, when you need some piece of functionality. And it's very easy to leave it there. But a funny thing happens when you do that. This code is running on your gem file, on your production servers, and if it is left untended and unupdated, it will rot and it will wither, and it will cause you problems. And you may not even know it's causing you problems until a customer calls or you start losing some piece of data. And this comes down to the idea that dependencies are not free. And this is not a new idea, we know this, but it's easy to forget. There's a very good blog post on the Joel on Software blog from 2001 about the Excel team's approach to dependencies. Find the dependencies and eliminate them. So for the Excel team, they took this to the extreme, going as far to write a C compiler for the Excel project. Now, that is pretty bonkers, especially coming from a web backend if you're shipping web servers. But he goes on. The Excel team's ruggedly independent mentality also meant that they always shipped on time and their code was of uniformly high quality. Now, that is not to say that we should empty our gem file of all our gems, but we need to take it into account the cost of having dependencies. For the Excel team, they decided it was cheaper and easier for them to do it themselves. But for us, it might be different. I'm not going to build my own Rails web framework. I would rather use Rails. But I need to be committed to keeping it up to date. And that goes for all of our dependencies. And I'll give you an example of how this can go wrong. And this is from our app. So we integrate with QuickBooks Online. And to do that, we use a gem called QuickBooks Ruby. QuickBooks Ruby uses another gem called OAuth. And we have used this gem in our app for many years. For reasons, we have it pinned to an old version of OAuth. Now, this was fine when we added the QuickBooks Ruby gem. It happened to work with this version of OAuth. That was great. However, about 6 months later, we needed to update QuickBooks Ruby to get a bug fix. And unfortunately for us, the QuickBooks Ruby team upgraded the version of OAuth their app depended on. So we were faced with this choice. Don't upgrade any of the gems and leave the bug in the app, or upgrade both gems and blow the scope of this otherwise simple bug fix ticket. We chose C. Fork the gem, downgrade it, and point it to our version of OAuth. Now, at the time, this probably seemed like a clever idea. But we quickly realized that this short-term win cost us in the long run. Anytime we wanted to go upgrade QuickBooks Ruby, we had to go to our fork, merge in upstream, make sure that it worked with our version of OAuth, go back to our application, and point the gem file to the new SHA. And that's a lot of steps, and developers don't like doing manual steps. So you can guess what happened. We never upgraded this gem. It just stayed on the same version until we absolutely could not get away from updating. It looks like this. Doesn't fit on the slide. And this comes down to this idea, that rigid dependencies are more difficult to maintain. If you have pinned versions, it's going to be harder to upgrade them. If you've got forked ones, it's going to be even tougher. Another thing happened during those gaps, and that is we merged some code. And then we merged some more code. And then we hired more developers, and we merged more code. And a funny thing happens when you ask a developer to build something. They look through the app, they find something that looks similar, they copy it, and they paste it, and they tweak it, and they ship it. And that works great if your code base is pristine. But if there's bad patterns, they start to propagate. The longer you have calls to unusual older Rails methods or calls to unusual old gems, the more calls to those gems will appear in your app. And that's not a problem with changes like this. It's very easy when you're doing an upgrade to change before filter to before action. But some changes are more difficult to extract. Adder accessible and adder protected are some of the most difficult that I came across. And when we were faced with removing this from our app during our Rails 3 to Rails 4 upgrade, we decided to use protected attributes to give us a little bit more runway. And if you're not familiar with this gem, you're lucky. But what it does is it lets you continue to use adder protected and adder accessible into Rails 4. And the idea is to give you a little bit more runway. So when you finish your update, you can remove them. But once we get to Rails 4, it's easy to forget to go back and clean up. Now, I know we're not the only ones who did this because it has been downloaded 5 million times since it came out, and this is the only thing it is used for. To put that into perspective, Active Record since 5.0 has been downloaded 15 million times. The other thing that happened when we were behind in those gaps is that we started to disconnect from the Rails community. We started to solve problems that were already solved by Rails, but weren't available to us because we were running an older version. This happened in Rails 4.1 with Active Record enum. Whenever we needed to map an integer in the database to a string in our app, we built something that approximated enum, Active Record enum. In fact, before it even existed. But actually, we didn't build just one. We built 2 or maybe 3, things that were similar in behavior, but slightly different. And it's because we have people all over the company needing similar things and reaching and not finding it, so they build it. And when we upgraded to Rails 4.1, we started to use Active Record enum, but we did not go back and fix those other things. They worked fine. And it's difficult to make a business case for something that works fine. This happened in Rails 4.2 with Active Job. We already were invested in another solution, and so we skipped it. So these gaps, they make me feel like this. They demoralize you. They discourage you from doing what you ought to do. So how can we close those gaps? So the good news is that everything you need to do to upgrade Rails, well, almost everything, can be done at any time and in very small steps. And to do this, and to encourage people to do this at Clio, we did 3 things. The first one was to keep the gem file healthy. Going back to those rigid dependencies, now this is real code from our gem file, well, our old gem file. Just drop those version constraints. It might be tempting to leave them, to pin it, to make bundler happy. But if you can, find the reason that you're pinning it, and get rid of that reason, and then unpin it. And, oh yeah, that feels great. And then for these forks, you need to kill them. If version constraints are rigid, these are an order of magnitude worse. And they're actually quite difficult to pull out if you've ever tried, especially if it's years ago and you're not really sure why you forked it and what the differences are and what might break. And that feels great as well. And the last thing for gems, and this is the most difficult one, it is to create a culture of updating gems eagerly. And this means not when you need a feature, not when you need a bug fix, not when it's out of security maintenance, but at every opportunity. And there are some tools to help with this. The first one is bundle outdated. And if you're not familiar with this, it spits something out like this. Now it's small text, but it is an alphabetized list of all the gems in your app that are out of date. If we zoom in on one of those, you can see we've got the name of the gem, the newest version available, the version you have installed, the version you asked for if you pinned it to a specific version, or even if you gave it a range, and the group. The trouble with this is that it can become overwhelming. This is the output that I saw, that I saw when I ran it for our app. This is actually discourse. There's about 100 items. When I ran it in our app, I saw 250 items. 250 gems that are out of date. So where do I start? What gems should I update first? What is most important? What is unmaintained? And what is the oldest? It's pretty difficult to tell. So to help with this and to help us internally, using a lot of the stuff that powers bundle outdated, we wrote a small script. And it works very similar to bundle outdated. And the first mode it has is outdated. It looks something like this. And this is the first 5 lines of the output. And the first thing that's different is that this is not an alphabetized list, but this is the oldest to newest. If we zoom in on one of those lines, it's pretty similar, but different in some notable ways. The first one is, well, the name is the same. It gives you the installed version. It tells you how old it is, and then it tells you what the newest version is and how old that is. So with just this one line, you can tell 7 years old, probably should update that. And you know what? The latest version is 4 years old. This one might not be maintained. So I probably should get rid of this entirely. Or if I really do need this, maybe I take over maintenance. The second mode is geared specifically to Rails upgrades, and that's the compatibility mode. You pass it a Rails version, the version you want to go to, in this case, Rails 5.2, and it'll give you output like this. If we focus in on the first section, this gives you a list of all of the gems that are incompatible with Rails 5.2 and what version you need to go to make it compatible. The second section is all of the gems that are incompatible with Rails 5.2 and have no compatible version. So immediately you can tell that you can't use jQuery Rails with Rails 5.2. You need to get rid of it, or you need to take over maintenance and make it compatible. And at the end, it just tells you how many gems you got to go before you can upgrade. So this is a focused look at what you need to do to get your gem file up to date to run on Rails 5.2. So that's keep the gem file healthy. The next one is outlaw deprecations. I mentioned how deprecations are getting actually really great. And in fact, if you go minor version to minor version, oftentimes you can just fix deprecations and it takes care of most of the work for you. Here is a pretty straightforward and good example of a deprecation. If I pass a user into find, Active Record isn't happy about it, but it'll find the record for me. But it tells me, please pass the ID of object by calling ID. Okay, easy enough. I can go through and tweak this and add it. And you know what? This works in Rails. If you're on Rails 4.2, this works in Rails 4.2, and you can make that change immediately. If you're anything like us, normally those go to the Rails log, but there are other modes like raise. And what this will do is when any deprecation comes, Active Record will or Active Support rather, will raise an exception. If you're anything like us, you have thousands of deprecations in your app. And if you did this, your test suite would go red and your app would break in many, many ways. So this was never an option for us. But if we left this off and started to fix those deprecations, somebody else might be adding them back in a different PR. And so it became a difficult race against time. And if you have an upgrade team, it can be difficult to win that race. So to bridge that gap, we added a deprecation tracker. And this is a really, really simple 150 lines of code that ties into Active Support notifications and keeps track of all of the deprecations that come out of your test suite. It works like this. You set it to save mode. You run your tests. It outputs a list of deprecations into a JSON file. Then on CI or locally, you can run it in compare mode. And if any of those deprecations change, it'll raise an exception. It'll fail your test suite. Now, this makes a big difference because it takes all of the problems in your app and it says it will get no worse. It doesn't matter if we've got 1,000 or 10,000. We won't add that 10,000th and one. It's planting a flag in the ground and saying, this is as bad as it's going to get, and we can improve it slowly over time. And another cool thing happens. Oh yeah, so this is what it looks like on CI. Gives you a diff. And I think it's animating something. Yep. It tells you deprecation warnings have changed. This is a really, really key thing. You don't have to watch your developers. You don't have to say, hey, don't do that thing where you pass an active record object into find. Rails, CI will tell you. You have to be very intentional about adding a deprecation warning. Another side effect of this was that we got a nice to-do list. We had a test file, and we knew exactly what deprecations came out of that test file. And with this, we could do some interesting things. We could write a small script that would parse that JSON file, and it would give us some info. So here we have a top 10 list of all the deprecations in our app. So there's 608 positional argument deprecations across all our test suite. And it also, because it tied into your tests, could run those tests for you. So this would run all of the deprecations, all of the tests that had deprecations in your app. If that's too many, you can give it a pattern. So it'll only run the tests that have deprecations that include this pattern. And combined with that top 10 list, this lets you zero in on a certain message. You know, get in a headspace, you're fixing the active record find problems, and you just go through the app, tweak it, tweak it, tweak it. And you can ship any one of those changes as you go. Once you're done, you put it into the save mode. This will update that JSON file, and you can merge it in. And slowly, over time, you can actually get to the place where you could turn this on. Now, you might not want to turn this on in production, but you could turn it on in CI. You could turn it on in development. And your developers would see immediately when something's not right. So that's outlaw deprecations. The last one is to dual boot Rails Next. Rails Next is a really, really neat concept. It's a very simple concept, and it's one that I first saw in a post from Shopify about the Rails 5 upgrade. And it's this, that you're always going to another version of Rails. There will always be an upgrade, and it is whatever is next for you. So if you're on 4.2, it's 5.0. If you're on 5.0, it's 5.1. 5.2, well, it's master, it's beta, it's an RC. There's always something to go to next. And the big deal about dual booting is that it lets people very quickly, even if they don't worry about the details of how it works, it lets them very easily start using the next version of Rails and tweaking it and using it to find deprecations or whatever they need to do. We do it like this. We have a small bin next command, and any command that runs after it, rspec or deprecation tracker, it is all run in the next version of Rails. And this lets people go through the app, find an old deprecated thing, run it in both versions very easily, and change it for something new that works in both versions. And you can almost always find something that works in both versions. If you cannot, you can put one of these in. We have a small helper method on our application object that will let us switch based on if we're in the next version or if we're in our current version. And, you know, I don't feel great about it. You know, taking that one nice line and turning it into a conditional, not great, but it's a very specific conditional. And using a Rubicop custom cop, you can actually auto fix these once you're done. You can run one command, it'll clean this up and just leave the new thing. The way we do dual booting, and there's a couple different ways to do it, is we create a symlink of our gem file, and then we add this method to the top of it. All it does is it checks, hey, what file am I? Am I the next one? And using that, we can then switch to a different version of Rails. So next is 5.2 in this case, and current is 5.1. Those two gem files feed into two separate gem file locks. And this is important because if you don't do this, you will find that every single time you try to boot into the next version of Rails, you'll see a lot of churn in your gem file, in your gem lock file, gem file lock. This binnext command will do that for you, that symlinking and that extra method, if you pass this --init. And it's really a simple bash script. This is without error handling, but it does two primary things. It sets environment variables, and these are just bundler configurable variables. Where's the gem file, and where should I put gems after I install it? And then it runs a command. If that command starts with bundle, it just leaves it. Otherwise, it'll wrap it in bundle exec. And this means, again, that you can take commands that you already know and run them with the next version of Rails. You don't need to understand how it works. You don't need to worry about anything like that. You just do what you know how to do and prepend it. So when you see a tweet like this, there's an RC out. It takes you 5 minutes to point your gem file at that new version and run it. And once you have it dual booting, you have the potential to put it on CI. Remember, with the deprecation list, we planted a flag and said, it will get no worse. Well, you can do that with your tests too. You don't need to have a green 100% passing test suite in the next version of Rails, but you can say that people, you can make it so people can't add any more failures. And the way we do that with our spec is tag any spec that does fail in the next version of Rails. If you run it in the current version of Rails, it passes, it works great. If you run it in the next version of Rails, you see it as a pending spec. And this is really, really, it's just 5-6 lines of our spec config. And it just conditionally marks it as pending. And once you have this, and you mark all of the tests in your code base for pending for Rails next, you can actually have CI running for current and CI running for next. And you need them both to be green before you merge code. Now, this means you're running two CI suites, but if they're running at the same time, it shouldn't increase any additional overhead, and things will not get worse. So that is those 3 items there. And really, what these 3 things focus on is making it easy to do the right thing, specifically for the upgrade. Making it so the path of least resistance happens to be the thing you really want to do. It's easy to upgrade gems. It's hard to add deprecation. And the code, the examples are in a gem. It's not the kind of gem you put in your gem file, but you can try it out locally. You can copy it and paste it. There's none of the things I've shown today are any longer than like 150 lines of code. So take it, tweak it, use it. There's also a really, really good blog video actually from RailsConf this year about how Shopify does their Rails upgrades. Really, really interesting stuff to see how they make sure. There's a lot of shared patterns, but just slightly different take on them. So I recommend checking that out as well. So to close, looking back at our 2 companies, what would the big company's Rails upgrade look like if they applied all of the things we talked about today? Well, they wouldn't have many gems to upgrade because they've been keeping them up to date. And so it would just be maybe the Rails specific gems. Or maybe they have to remove a couple gems. But it's much better than it was. And when it comes to code changes, because they're keeping up to date on all the deprecations, there's far fewer changes there as well. When it comes to test failures, their app not only boots, but they actually know exactly how many failures they have. And maybe they've been proactive and on Friday afternoons have been fixing them as they go. And when it comes time to deploy, it's less terrifying, but it's still pretty terrifying. It's always pretty scary when you push a new version of Rails. There are ways to make this less scary, but I didn't have time to cover them today. So one important thing that I realized when looking back is that we need to blur the lines between Rails upgrade time and every other time. We need to get rid of those gaps and make it one continuous motion. Because in the diagram between things that prepare your app for Rails upgrades and things that make your code base better, it looks less like this and more like this. The things that make your app easy to upgrade in Rails will also make it an easier place for your developers to work. And that brings us back to Clio. This is a new concept for us, if you look at the history of the company. And we're still working at it. But since we started to do this, been able to remove 33 gems. We've upgraded another 27. We've reduced our deprecations in the current version of Rails to 0. And we're starting to track the next version so we can proactively get rid of any deprecations. We've also fixed about 3,000 of our 3,300 failings. And this is not done by a Rails upgrade team. This is something we presented to the team and we said, hey, we can do this together. You don't need to have a deep knowledge of Rails. You just follow the messages and go. And it made for an upgrade process that everyone can contribute to. And this is particularly important if you have a growing team. If you have 10 developers churning out code, you have a 10-person upgrade team. If you've got 50, you've got a 50-person upgrade team. Doesn't matter how big you grow, you can always update your app. And you don't need to sequester 3, 4 people and make them update all your old code. So Rails upgrades, they are hundreds of tiny changes that can happen at any time. Don't wait. Thank you. And any questions? Yeah. Yeah, the question is, do you have a way to detect gems that aren't used at all? Yeah, that is a difficult one. Dead code detection in Ruby would be really, really nice. The best way we know to do it is to just look. And the best bet is to start with those old ones. But no silver bullets from me on that one. Right. Do we use any tools to auto-upgrade gems? We looked at one called, I can't remember the name of it, but it did do that for you. It would open PRs against your repo. Unfortunately, like a lot of integrations, it required full code access. So we have not turned that on. So that is something that I would love to see because then it becomes even more proactive, for sure.
Do that.
Oh, nice. Like
Interesting.
which gems?
Okay, I wrote one 7 years ago, so I believe it doesn't work anymore. It's called bundler auto update, and it would like go through the gem file and make commits and run the test for you. They
Oh,
could like
awesome.
it was working back in the days, but I've seen that there are like others that seems to be way better than bundler auto update. So you can run that on CI on the side.
Oh, cool. That's a great idea. And was there one? Yeah.
Just wondering, I assume you saw Eileen Neuchâtel's blog post about how GitHub did this. And it sounds like you were doing this about, or maybe not, okay. You were doing it about the same time as GitHub was doing it, so I was gonna ask
Oh,
if
yes, the
you
one
had.
more recently. I actually
Yeah.
haven't read that one yet, but I did see that one go by.
Oh, okay,
They
'cause-
just released, they're on 5, are they on 5.0?
I think they're on 5.2,
5.2?
aren't they? Like they're all the way up. I
Yeah,
think they went
yeah.
all the way, maybe 5.1, I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
remember.
GitHub's an interesting one because I know that they were 3.2 on a fork, and it was
Yes.
quite a journey, I
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah. Anyway, I was going to ask if you thought what you were doing was similar to what they were doing, but I guess that's an unfair question if you haven't had a chance. But
Yeah.
I mean, in my small I only read her post once quickly, but I can see that it sounds like a lot of what you guys discovered is what GitHub discovered. So I think there's a fair bit of similarity there.
Yeah, and I think that Shopify talk also, there's some similarities there with that incremental approach, for sure. Yeah. A little more detail, because I know the GitHub article Shopify will make a same gem file with conditionals right in one gem file. You have gem file next. So there is only one gem file, but there's a symlink, and it's all still one gem file, which is nice because you don't have to keep two in sync. But yeah, we found that just works better. The other ways I've seen it, I always had problems with churn in the gem file lock. But the symlink seems to work great because it's one file, and then Bundler knows exactly how to work with that natively. There's no bundler patching necessary. The symlink is, so there's one gem file, and we symlink that gem file to another file called gem file next. And so there's just that one source of truth for all of our gems. And within that one file, we do the switching. We do the conditional logic. I can show you the gem file after too, if you want it. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Question: do we have conditionals around other gems in the gem file? And yes. When we can't get away from it, we will. Sometimes it's just as simple as don't use this in the next version of Rails. Use it in the old version. Certain, especially things that like backport functionality. I know test after commit was one where it doesn't work in Rails 5.0 because Rails 5 does it. Yeah. Cool. Thank you everyone for coming.